Hello everybody, we are going live today with Caryn to continue talking about attachments. We're doing a part 2. Let's just see if she's joining. Here we are. Accepting. We're just waiting for Caryn to come on. We're doing part 2 on attachments, theory and types. Hi Caryn.
Hey, we did it.
Alrighty, yes we are.
Okay.
So we're going to make it a brief part 2. We got some good questions, so we're going to go right into them. Thank you, Michali, for joining. Hi, everybody that's joining. Good to see you guys. Okay, so first, I guess I wanted to ask the first question. We kind of brought together a couple of questions so that we can address things in a time-sensitive way. So the first is, what might be a good way to try and figure out your type after learning them if it doesn't feel obvious?
Okay, so it can be hard when you first hear about the types. You might feel like you relate to different elements. So what I find is really useful to take into your own life to try to figure out your personal type is to look at what triggers you. So a trigger is when past experiences come into your present. An example of something like that is like you're in a grocery store and the cashier says something rude to you and you leave and you're livid. And you think to yourself, I don't know this person. This really probably wasn't so personal, but my reaction feels so strong. That's a good indication that something from your past is coming into this present experience. So a lot of times in relationships, whether it be friends, dating, marriage, you can easily become triggered. And what you can notice is, what are the kinds of things that trigger me? So I'll give an example now of something, one or two things that would be like something that comes up in an anxious attachment. I think anxious and avoidant are the ones that are hardest to see the difference in.
Correct.
Because they're sort of the same level, right?
Correct. A lot of the questions that came in were like, how do I know if I'm anxious or avoidant? I feel like I have both, or, so.
Right. So I'm going to try to give some triggers that show like which one you might. So in a situation like on a date where one person says something like, hey, I'm a doctor and I know that this might be rude, but I'm going to need to check my phone in the middle of the date because it could really be an emergency. And the other person says, oh, okay, I guess that makes sense. I could be okay with that. And then, said doctor picks up their phone, reads a text message, and the other person notices, I said I was okay with this, but I'm like really upset. And I really feel a sense of like abandonment. Like, I'm not interesting enough. You don't want to hear me. Even though they were warned again. So it's never a nice thing to send a text or to read a text on a date.
Let's make sure that message is clear for guys.
Exactly.
Girls.
It's not acceptable for anybody, generally speaking, but let's say it is something emergency.
Is like the one extreme. I would say it's definitely makes sense that it would bother anybody because it's not a nice thing to do. It's basically saying my phone right now, whoever's on my phone is more important than the person.
Exactly. So even giving this example, I'm aware that that's not polite. It's not really acceptable behavior for the most part. But in this situation, what's different is the person said, listen, it's urgent. This is my job. It's life or death, right? Like, I'm a doctor here. And the person is saying, I could be okay with that. But what they notice is there's an extra trigger here. Something about this feels very personal, even though this might be a first date. I don't really know you. It's probably not that I'm boring. Right. And that would usually indicate that you may have an anxious attachment. And the reason for that is anxious attachment comes with feelings of abandonment, because in your with your caretaker, it was they're present sometimes, they're emotionally present sometimes, and there wasn't a security to that emotional presence that it's all the time. So it can feel very abandoned, right? There's a real sense of abandonment to that. So on a date, when somebody is doing something, even though they warned you and it's not the nicest, but there's a cause here, you can feel like a real sense of abandonment. And that's why I'm using this particular example, because somebody losing attention in that moment can feel like can feel like an abandonment. Specifically to the anxious type, an avoidant type might be like, oh, I got away with 5 minutes less of conversation. I kind of like this. Right. Another example of that would be, so an anxiously attached person is dating somebody and the person says, I'm I'm going to text you. Yeah, this was so great. Like, we should totally hang out again. I'm going to text you. And a day goes by and they haven't been texted. And again, the anxious person might really feel more strongly triggered. So it doesn't mean nobody else would ever get triggered, but more strongly triggered that, again, there's that sense of abandonment. You said you had a good time. You said you were there for me. Where are you? And the text message might be really kind. And the date went really well. And again, it doesn't necessarily feel so personal, but there's that trigger. There's my past coming in of, you weren't there. You didn't set the boundaries with me of when you would be there. And that's scary to me. That doesn't feel secure to me. So those are some things that would come up more so in an anxious attachment. In avoidant, they actually might like the disconnect sometimes. Oh, okay, they're going to text me. Cool. I could be spontaneous about that. Awesome. I had a day off from this situation. It didn't get heavy for me. It didn't get intense. And that's more how they would react to that situation. So we can see the difference there. A trigger more for like an avoidant, somebody who's avoidantly attached, would be more like they're on a date and the person gets like very personal very quickly. And they feel like, whoa, that's a lot for me. I haven't been taught. Again, it all comes from just what was my experience. So I haven't been taught that it's safe for me to put my emotions and be out there and be so vulnerable, because that was not something that got accepted in my household with my caretaker. So you like coming at me with a lot of questions, a lot of very personal information, or asking me to give very personal information is really triggering. And I may now have a desire to withdraw. So that's the kind of thing that would come up more for an avoidant person, where it's, I want to avoid, I want to maybe avoid conflict. I want to avoid very emotional questions. I want to avoid some vulnerability because those weren't safe in my experience, versus the anxious, where I didn't know that I would get that security, that consistency of presence, of emotional presence, or the focus would be on me. So when you take attention away in a way that feels really hurtful, I feel abandoned now because that was my experience. So it's just sort of a difference. Yeah. Sorry.
Examples are great. And what's so interesting though, as you're saying this, I'm thinking, and these two people find each other, right? Like,
these two people find each other.
That's so interesting to me because they're so different. Like they're so like in these core ways, right?
Yeah. And I think part of that is because as people, we really do have a desire to grow. So there's something that seems nice about the difference. Oh, this person can seem so calm, this avoidant person, to my anxiousness. I love that energy. That might really work for me. They don't get as maybe intense as me about certain things. That could feel really nice. And the avoidant person thinking the same, like, how nice that you could be so vulnerable, that you can really put yourself out there, that you can ask me when I'm going to text you. That could feel so great, except we each have our triggers, and there are moments where we're susceptible to feeling really triggered, and we don't notice it until we're in that moment. So then it becomes, whoa, that's a lot. You've abandoned me. You're making me withdraw. And it feels like that conflict.
Right. And I love these examples because it's also like, whoever you are, even if you have a secure attachment, you might feel triggered by any of these examples. So if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, I would feel triggered by that, and I would feel triggered by that, that's okay. The question is, to what degree? Like, where are you taking it, right? That's where you know, oh, maybe this is an attachment issue or thing that I should be working on. You know, it's okay to be like, hey, why didn't I get a text till the next day? Or, hey, you know, why are you like on your phone constantly? Or like, is it too much? Or does this bother me? Like, it's okay to check in with yourself. The question is, when you jump to those conclusions and you're like, oh my God, immediately this is like a trigger in a big way, that's when you know this might be an attachment thing. And then I love that you give the hope of like, it's totally manageable, and it's not like a diagnosis, even though those are manageable too.
Exactly. It's this awareness, and that's why we're sort of clarifying, right? Because this awareness also really, really helps. It's not necessarily the relationship having the issue. It's I have wounds from experiences I have had, and what if I could work with those, right? And first step, what if I notice those? And another way that you can even notice it is, what books do I like? What music do I like? A colleague of mine said that in sessions they'll ask, like, tell me about songs that you really connect to. And I think that was such an awesome thing, because sometimes when you're noticing lyrics that really are meaningful to you, you can realize, right, there's a little bit, right, like songs that are like, their emotions are so much for me, and that's like speaking to you because you're like, yes, like that's so much for me. When my friends do that, when my partner does that, maybe that would hint at an avoidant attachment. Again, if you're noticing the pattern, loving one song obviously
Right.
doesn't mean that you have any sort of attachment thing going on, but noticing that that music really speaks to you, that you really connect to either of these kinds of triggers will really give you a sense of, oh, that might be something that was missing for me.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Got it. So anxious, I'm so curious about this. The type of songs that you would like are more, let's say, for example, the anxious person would like more, what type of like the content would be more about like being close to somebody, or versus like the avoidant would be more about like enjoying breakup songs. Like I'm just.
So neither would, right. They would both want closeness, and they both might have peace and breakups. But
So how would
I
that
would say that
like I believe that it could be a good indicator, but I just can't.
What would it look like? Yeah. So I think avoidant would more relate to things of like, I really want to be close to you. I don't know how, that sort of push and pull that happens. I mean, in an anxious, where I really, really want this closeness. I feel so drawn to you, and then I'm scared you'll leave me. There's a lot of music like that, right? Of again, that fear, the underlying fear with anxious is abandonment, of I'm going to test you if we get really close because I'm scared you'll leave me in some way. Songs of breakup songs of like, you left me, you made me feel so alone. Again, can happen to anybody, but sometimes there's a nuance to it that makes you feel like, oh, right, it makes sense for the anxious, because it's really like, I got close to you and you left me. Just again, like the way that their caretaker, like they tried expressing themselves a lot and their caretaker was sometimes there.
Mm-hmm. Taking some notes. Yeah, I like what you said. Like it clicks for me. Like the anxious, the underlying fear is the fear of abandonment.
Yeah, and the avoidant, it's a fear of being overwhelmed, because again, they feel that they overwhelmed their caretaker, because again, their experience was these very strong boundaries in their house. Like, we don't share things. Sharing is for like outside of here. We don't do that. Even the caretaker, right? I can't tell them if I'm really sad, because sad is an emotion we don't necessarily do in this house. We don't sweat the small stuff is my favorite quote to like know you may have had an avoidant attachment. Parents who say we don't sweat the small stuff, right? So songs with that of like, you were overwhelming me, I really wish I could have been there for you, I didn't know how. Or there, again, also a sense of space for themselves. I don't know how to be vulnerable, right? That's a really hard thing for avoidant people. They would love to be. Everybody would love to be able to feel safe being vulnerable. That's what's missing for both people. But it's like, there was no safety in that. There was no space for that. So those are some of the things. Again, it is nuanced, and I understand confusion.
No, but
in
this
avoidant, it would come. Okay, awesome. So yeah, in avoidant, it would come off more as being overwhelmed by the idea of vulnerability or being emotional. In anxious, it would come out more as a fear of abandonment. Even though, again, the underlying is my needs didn't get met. I was not able to fully express myself as a child.
Okay. And avoidant, fear of overwhelming themselves. They get easily overwhelmed themselves, and they have a fear of overwhelming others. Is that correct?
I would say it comes from the fear of overwhelming others. They've kind of learned not to, so they withdraw a lot. Okay. So they're not as afraid anymore, usually, as adults.
Afraid of overwhelming themselves. It's more that is that correct?
Yeah, I would say they present more as being afraid of being overwhelmed, because what they learned was that emotions or vulnerability is overwhelming
others. Exactly. Okay, beautiful. Okay, that really clarifies things, I hope, for listeners as well. Okay, so next question. Once you identified your type, you mentioned healing. How would one help themselves with this? How can one get to a healthier, more secure attachment?
Okay, so to me, this part is really important, because what do we do now, right? So I'm going to try to make this as clear as possible. So what I want to mention, there's kind of two parts of healing. I do think that therapy is really beneficial to both, and I'm going to explain why. It's not just a disclaimer of like, everybody go to therapy, which of course I believe in, but also why specifically for attachment is because for a lot of people, they've pushed away this pain, right? When people say, I'm not sure my type, also partly because haven't necessarily allowed either of those vulnerabilities in fully, because it's hard to say my caretaker didn't give me this, right? And it brings up, in order to heal, what we have to do is bring up the past pain. We have to allow the wounds in so we could see them, so we could gain awareness, because as we all know, awareness is the key to everything. Yes. So to be aware, without somebody objective, without somebody empathic, can become overwhelming. So that's my reason for feeling therapy is a great place to do this. It doesn't mean it can't be done without. It's just, again, like a safety disclaimer. This is hard work. It's hard to do for yourself, to be objective and see it, as well as to hold all that pain that can come up from what we call attachment wounds. So there are wounds here because we're bringing up now, I really felt abandoned. When I came home from school and my mom was always on the phone, I was a sad kid because it hurt, right? So people may say things like that. Or when I told my mom that I scraped my knee and she said, we don't sweat the small stuff, that really hurt me. And I have to relive the sad, the shame, the fear, and that's hard to hold. So I recommend therapy for it because that's what the work is allowing those feelings that we've maybe pushed aside to come up and then have compassion for them. I was just a little girl or a little boy, and my mom should have gotten off the phone when I came home from school, even if it was important. Like 5 minutes should have been given to me maybe right away, or a hug or acknowledgement, right? I should have been allowed to cry over scraped knee because I was 7, and it was appropriate to cry over, even if it was small, even if it wasn't bleeding, because I was hurt and I needed to know that somebody could be there for me fully in that moment.
Yes.
So that's part 1. And then the part 2, which I think also requires therapy, is because it can be hard to see our caregivers this way. It can feel a little bit negative, and we are, as children, kind of taught to be defensive of our parents because or caretaker, because it's not safe. It's not safe to think to yourself even, I feel really abandoned. You need these people fully. When you're very young, when you're not on your own yet. So to think of them as unsafe becomes really hard. So part of the work is also saying, I deserved better. I was born good. I was not born difficult, and therefore they couldn't withstand my difficult emotionality, right? People have told themselves those messages because it's easier than saying, I lived in an unsafe environment to an extent. And being able to see for yourself that you really are worthy, sometimes that takes for people a lot of work to really truly believe you were born worthy. Every single person deserves a secure attachment. Most people, unfortunately, don't get it, but it does take the recognition of, I was good, I was born good, I didn't get what I deserved. What can I do now? Can I allow myself to see these wounds, to see my caretakers as fallible humans who made mistakes that really cost me? And can I give myself the compassion to say, I really deserve better? And when we can do that, when we can allow all of this in, that's really hard to do. And when we can say, they really made mistakes that really hurt me, that still trigger me in my current life, we do heal, and we do get better in how we act toward ourselves, for sure, and how we react in relationships as well.
Right.
It really changes that.
Now, when somebody does this with a therapist, though, I can imagine that a lot of anger would come out towards a parent or parents that were less than perfect, right? So I think that's also why therapy is needed, and maybe also therapy gets a bad rap because of that, because somewhere along the process there's space between anger and then helping to heal that. But I think therapy is needed for the whole spectrum, and like working through that anger and coming to continue to love and respect and value the parents, hopefully, that was less than perfect, because they were doing their best too, right? So I think that's like an important point. There was something else that you were saying that slipped my mind as you were talking about therapy. Oh, I think that just to be able to see things objectively, like because somebody might think like, oh, I have some sort of attachment style, maybe this shouldn't bother me, or maybe this bothers me, because like to not know like whether that's like red flag or that's your attachment style, like,
right.
So I think that's another way that therapy can be super beneficial.
That's such a good point. Exactly. So again, the objectivity as well as the empathy, and that's what you're looking for. Again, if people are looking for a therapist, you want somebody who can remain objective to help you see things clearly, because it's very hard, especially with attachment, to see things fully clearly. As well as empathic, because you do deserve that. You deserve somebody who can now also show you that these emotions can be held, that whatever you're bringing up, whether it be anger, denial, right? Those are things where there's space for them now. So again, I do think it's best practice, right? In the way of the sort of easiest, though very difficult way to heal is through therapy. Doing it on your own can just become very overwhelming, because it's hard to see things, and it's also hard to hold them.
Right. And it's also, I think doing it on your own sometimes comes with like getting into messes and then figuring things out as you go along, which is okay. Like that's lived experience, but it's like you can't keep yourself in like a glass box while you figure things out on your own. So it's like the way you figure things out is by getting into maybe an unhealthy relationship and not understanding why it's unhealthy, and then reading books and then talking to people and then finding that mentor and then eventually ending up in therapy. I think therapy is like one of the fastest, non-intrusive ways in a sense, right? Not, this is not to plug therapy, like
Right.
therapy right now, I mean, you're a therapist and an excellent one at attachment, but it's just the facts, right?
Exactly. Again, and that just proves to the objectivity why it's helpful, because when you're in a relationship also, or even again, if you're already married, right, it can be hard to see that objectively. It can be hard. It can feel very overwhelming as things come up. And this is a way to, like, exactly like you said, sort of maintain your own life while also having the objectivity of, should I be maintaining? Should I get out of something? What's safe for me? What isn't? What is working in my life? What can I change? Is this a sense that I'm being triggered, or is this a sense like everybody would have an issue with this?
Correct.
Exactly like you said. So it just really helps with that. Like attachment to me is one of the things that is hardest for most people to be objective about. Where we come from, what we've been through, it's hard to be objective about all that. So
right.
It helps to have the objectivity.
Another little point on therapy and attachment is because I think that many people, their attachment to their therapist is very telling too. And I'm not sure if that's like how you work in your practice, but that's something that a conversation that was kind of exploding on our forums with crushing on a therapist, and basically it all pulls onto attachment, issues of some sort.
Right.
Like really good things to explore in therapy. So I think that that's just another way that therapy helps one explore such a thing.
For sure. And again, that objectivity that the therapist has, so that if you feel like your attachment is coming up, you may notice it, right? And the therapist will notice it also, right? For example, like a client who's ghosting, that often can have to do with avoidance. So we can have the perspective to say, oh, okay, something's happening here where maybe just talking about things became overwhelming and you're withdrawing, because that's a pattern that you may have and it could be worked with. And again, this is a person who knows that. So it's helpful because it's still a relationship, but it's a way to work out those patterns.
Correct. I love it. Okay, let's see if you still have a couple of minutes for another question.
Okay, sure.
Okay, is everyone in the family the same? Like, is that the typical that all family members would have the same attachment style?
So what I would say with this is, within each style, there can be a spectrum. I think it is most likely just because, again, in an anxious household, a family would be somewhat enmeshed. In an avoidant household, there would be very, very strong distant boundaries. Disorganized, there's a lot of trauma there usually. And insecure, again, there's that consistency. Is it possible for a parent to, let's say, be more consistent with their oldest? A trauma happens, life changes happen, and they're less consistent with the next children? Yes. But for the most part, I would say there's usually a leaning toward a type and then a spectrum. So one child might be more anxiously attached, may have felt more abandonment type issues. Maybe that child, for whatever reason, was sort of more triggering to the parents and they didn't react well to them. But I would say, again, most likely is that, let's say, a home would be anxiously attached, some siblings more anxiously, some siblings a little closer to secure. So it can be a spectrum, but I would say for the most part, what we see is that a family will kind of fall into one.
Got it. Love it. Okay, we have one more, yes?
Yes.
If we're already in a relationship, how do we use this insight and awareness?
Okay, so again, we go back to the triggers. If we can notice our own triggers, right, we can work with them, and our partner can notice their triggers. Again, couples therapy might be the most helpful because it's hard, it's very vulnerable to talk about your triggers, and you may need an objective voice, objective, empathic voice to help you discuss your triggers. But what's also important is, again, putting up those boundaries, discussing the triggers. So again, we have like our anxious avoidant, because fun couple to work with, for examples, right? Is it really hurts me when you look at your phone. I know that you don't necessarily mean to pull away from me, but it feels personal to me because I've been through things like that. Is it possible for you not to do that so much? It's very hard for me when you ask me a lot of personal questions at once. I'm working on that, but it can make me feel an instinctive desire to withdraw. Is it possible that you kind of warn me if we're going to get into that kind of discussion? I'm able to tell you this is as much as I could do right now. Right. And again, sometimes those patterns are hard to learn on your own. So couples therapy can be very helpful for that. But those are the kinds of things that can be worked on. Can I personally notice my triggers? Am I comfortable telling you what they are? And can we work with each other's triggers? And again, the more we notice our own and we work through our wounds, the less likely we are to be as triggered. So that in and of itself makes it easier in a relationship. So self-work is always really important, but the relationship as well. Just because an anxious marries an avoidant, or disorganized marries a disorganized. And again, I don't mean to label people out their attachments, but just for the sake of time. But somebody with those attachment styles marrying somebody else, it doesn't mean any sort of relationship is doomed. It means we want to notice. We want to both notice. Where might we have had in a disorganized, where might we have certain things that are similar? Where might the differences be? What are you doing that's hurtful to me? What am I doing that's hurtful to you? What do I notice about these interactions that I can share? And what are we both willing to do to change the nature and the perspective of the interaction?
Love it. And in dating, I would imagine that if someone's dating, they can see a therapist, but do you recommend, and this could totally be like a trick question, so feel free to be like, I plead the fifth, but would you sometimes or typically or always or never recommend that the girl and boy bring it up between themselves, or only with the help of a therapist? Whether, meaning like if someone's seeing a therapist, then they bring it up, like what's your experience with these type of things in dating?
So I would say it really depends. I think, again, counseling while dating is just super helpful. Dating is triggering onto itself, attachment and other areas. So I think that it's very, very helpful to discuss attachment with an individual therapist, value systems. And then depending sort of where your work goes, I would check in with the individual therapist and say, might it be helpful to bring in my partner? Should we both be going to someone else? It's too individualized for me to like give a blanket statement, but I would say it's definitely something to check in on. I think that like couples counseling for engaged or soon to be engaged couples can be super helpful in learning what are our similar values, what are the differences in our experiences. How do we want to work on this dynamic? I think, again, I'm a big believer in prevention. Like the earlier in life you're willing to take a look at things, and again, not just willing, able, because sometimes it takes us time to be able to get there, and that's fine. Whenever we are willing to take a look and gain awareness and feel safe to do so, it's very helpful to do that. It helps any sort of relationship. And also, again, doing it in therapy, I just think brings a safety and an objectivity that can be really helpful.
Totally. Love it. I love it. Thank you so much, Caryn. This was like so eye-opening, and I really appreciate it. And I'm sure everybody else does.
Great. Thank you so much, Faye.
Good. Thank you. We'll take it off here. Thank you guys. And